stars burn out. Empires crumble. Treaties rot in the archives of dead worlds. The galaxy runs on a simple, ruthless arithmetic, survival of the most heavily armed. When the Valerian species faced annihilation at the hands of the hegemony, the Galactic Council looked away. They offered prayers, not ships. They forgot about the muddy, scarred death world on the edge of the Orion Spur. They forgot that 2 centuries ago, the Valerians had handed humanity the stars. The Galactic Assembly Hall was a masterpiece of sterile architecture. Vaulted ceilings composed of hard light projections mimicked the skies of 100 different homeworlds, cycling through pleasant, inoffensive hues of blue, violet, and pale orange. The air always smelled faintly of ozone and synthetic jasmine. It was designed to be calming. To Ambassador Thomas Hayes, it smelled like an operating room right before they cut you open. Hayes sat in his designated pod, nursing a lukewarm cup of synthetic coffee. He wore a simple, tailored charcoal suit, a sharp contrast to the shimmering robes, iridescent scales, and ceremonial armor of the hundreds of delegates surrounding him. Humanity was a fringe species, a minor player. They had a seat at the table purely out of bureaucratic obligation, relegated to the outer rings of the amphitheater, where the lighting was poor and the translation earpieces occasionally hissed with static. Down in the center of the pit, the Valerian delegate was begging. His name was irrelevant to the assembly, but Hayes knew it. It was Arthur. The Valerians had a long-standing tradition of adopting the naming conventions of species they sponsored, a quirk of their deep-seated diplomatic idealism. Arthur looked terrible. The Valerians were typically tall, graceful bipeds with skin the color of polished bronze. Today, Arthur's skin was ashen. His posture, usually straight as a spire, was bent. He leaned heavily on the podium. Behind him, a massive holographic display rendered the cold, hard truth of his pleas. Cities were burning. Vast, sweeping arcologies that had stood for millennia were reduced to jagged, smoking teeth against a blackened sky. The hegemony did not conquer. They cleansed. Their ships, sleek and geometric, hung in the upper atmospheres of 3 Valerian colonies, methodically turning population centers into glass craters. 3 billion, Arthur's voice cracked. The universal translators stripped the emotion from his native tongue, delivering the words in flat, synthesized English to Hayes's ear. But the despair in the alien's body language was universal. 3 billion casualties in less than a standard month. The hegemony fleet has bypassed our outer defense grid. They are 3 jumps from Valera Prime. We cannot hold them. We are asking, we are pleading for the Assembly to honor the Mutual Defense Pact of the 7th cycle. Silence stretched across the massive chamber. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of people waiting for someone else to speak. Finally, the representative of the core worlds, a bloated, gelatinous bureaucrat named Grov, pulsed a bright, dismissive yellow. The Assembly acknowledges the tragedy unfolding in the Valerian sector. However, the hegemony has claimed this conflict is a localized border dispute regarding the mining rights of the Ceti Alpha Belt. To intervene would be a violation of our neutrality accords. Arthur gripped the edges of the podium. His knuckles turned white. They are burning our nurseries. They are glassing civilian centers. This is not a border dispute. It is an extermination. Language, delegate, Grove chided, his voice dripping with condescension. Hyperbole does not serve the logistics of the Assembly. A military intervention requires a 2/3 majority vote, a mobilization period of 6 standard months, and a clear strategic mandate. We simply do not have the resources to engage in a full-scale conflict with the hegemony over a fringe territory. Hayes felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. He looked around the vast auditorium. The avian delegates from the high-gravity worlds were preening their feathers. The silicon-based representatives were deep in secondary conversations, ignoring the hologram entirely. They didn't care. The Valerians were a peaceful, exploratory race. They had no heavy industry, no massive fleets. They were useful for trade and cultural exchange, but they possessed nothing the core worlds couldn't live without. They were expendable. Hayes remembered his history. 200 years ago, Earth was dying. The resource wars had poisoned the oceans and choked the sky with ash. Humanity had been weeks away from a final, suicidal nuclear exchange when a single, unarmed Valerian exploration ship breached orbit. They didn't come to conquer. They didn't come to judge. They dropped atmospheric scrubbers. They handed over the blueprints for rudimentary gravity drives. They asked for nothing in return, only expressing a quiet hope that humanity would one day join them in the stars. The Valerians had handed humanity a future. Now, the galaxy was handing the Valerians a death sentence. Arthur lowered his head. The fight left him all at once. He stepped away from the podium, the hologram fading into nothingness. The assembly immediately moved on to a debate regarding the taxation of hyperlane toll routes. Hayes didn't wait for the session to end. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked down the spiraling stairs toward the exit. He didn't look at the other delegates. He didn't file a formal protest. There was no point. Bureaucracy was a shield for cowards, and Hayes was done listening to cowards. He exited the chamber and walked briskly down the polished corridors toward the secure human embassy wing. His aide, a young woman named Sullivan, hurried to keep up. "Sir? Ambassador Hayes?" Sullivan asked, clutching a datapad. "The session isn't scheduled to recess for another 3 hours." "Cancel my afternoon appointment, Sullivan," Hayes said, his voice flat, cold. "All of them?" "Sir, the trade minister of—" "Cancel them," Hayes snapped. He stopped and turned to her. The look in his eyes made Sullivan take a half-step back. It was the look of a man who had just watched a friend get stabbed in the street while the police stood by and took notes. "Get me a secure, quantum-encrypted line to Earth, direct to Geneva. I need to speak to President Mitchell and Admiral Carter." Sullivan swallowed hard. "Priority level, sir?" 01, Omega. Sullivan's eyes widened. Omega wasn't a diplomatic code. It was a wartime mobilization order. "Right away, sir." Hayes keyed his retinal scan on the heavy blast doors of his office. He stepped inside, letting the heavy steel seal behind him. He walked to the wide plasteel window overlooking the gleaming, artificial cityscape of the assembly capital. It was beautiful. It was entirely fake. "They think we forgot," Hayes whispered to his own reflection in the glass. "They think we just took the gift and went to sleep." He turned toward his desk as the quantum communicator began to hum. It was time to wake up the monsters. Deep beneath the Alps, in a bunker lined with 10 feet of lead and reinforced polycrete, President Thomas Mitchell stared at the holographic projection of Ambassador Hayes. The room was Spartan. No mahogany desks, no leather chairs, just a massive steel table illuminated by the harsh, blue glow of strategic maps. Earth had not forgotten the days of ash. They had survived, but survival had left a permanent scar on the human psyche. They had spent the last 2 centuries preparing for a war they hoped would never come. They didn't build elegant ships with swooping lines and luxurious quarters. They built flying bricks, layered with ablative armor, and strapped to engines that violated the laws of physics through sheer, brute force. Across the table stood Admiral Arthur Carter. He was an older man, his face a map of deep creases, his left arm a brushed steel prosthetic. He watched the projection of Hayes with narrow, calculating eyes. "They refused, then," Mitchell said. "It wasn't a question. They offered thoughts and prayers, Mr. President," Hayes replied, his voice distorted slightly by the light years between them. The hegemony is 3 systems away from Valera Prime. The local planetary defenses are falling apart. They give it a week, maybe 2, before the orbital bombardment begins. Mitchell sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Carter. Admiral, if we intervene, we break the neutrality accords. We expose our fleet capabilities to the entire assembly. We paint a target on our own backs. With respect, Mr. President, Carter rumbled, leaning over the table. I don't give a damn about the Assembly's neutrality accords. The Assembly didn't pull our ancestors out of the radioactive mud. The Valerians did. I am aware of our history, Arthur, Mitchell said softly. Are we, sir? Carter pressed. He tapped a command on the console. The map shifted from the Valerian sector to a localized view of the Sol system. For 200 years we've played the quiet, backward apes. We sold them cheap minerals. We let them laugh at our archaic combustion engines. We kept our heads down, and while they debated tax laws and held galas, we hollowed out Ceres and turned it into a shipyard. We built the ghost armadas. Carter tapped another button. The holographic projection of the Sol system bloomed with thousands of red icons. They were clustered around Jupiter, hidden in the dense rings of Saturn, buried in the ice of the Oort cloud. We have 3,000 capital ships sitting in Darkhold, Carter continued, his voice rising with a grim, suppressed energy. We have railguns that can crack a moon. We have a standing army of 2 million Marines who have been doing nothing but running simulations against hegemony tactics for the last decade. We built this military for one reason, to ensure nobody ever pushed us to the brink of extinction again. The Valerians are at that brink right now. Mitchell looked back at Hayes's projection. Ambassador, what is the political fallout if we deploy? They will be terrified of us, Hayes said bluntly. The Assembly thinks our entire Navy consists of a few hundred border patrol cutters. When they see a full Terran mobilization, they will realize we lied to them for a century. They will sanction us. They might even embargo us. Let them, Carter growled. We are entirely self-sufficient. We designed our economy for isolation. Mitchell fell silent. The hum of the bunker's ventilation system felt oppressively loud. He was a politician, a man used to weighing variables, mitigating risks, finding the middle ground. But some debts couldn't be paid with diplomacy. Some ledgers had to be balanced in blood. He looked at the map of Valera Prime. He thought about the archives in Geneva, the crumbling, physical photographs of the first Valerian ship landing in the wasteland of North America. The image of a tall, bronze-skinned alien handing a simple water purification filter to a starving human child. Admiral Carter, Mitchell said, his voice suddenly hard, stripped of all hesitation. Carter straightened, snapping to attention. Sir, initiate Operation Archangel. Awaken the ghost armadas. You are authorized to use any and all kinetic force necessary to break the hegemony blockade over Valera Prime. Carter smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator that had finally been let off its leash. Yes, Mr. President. Ambassador Hayes, Mitchell turned to the projection. Pack your things. Leave the assembly. If they ask where you are going, tell them humanity is going to pay its debts. The transmission cut out. Within minutes, the Sol system changed. On the dark side of the moon, massive cloaking fields dropped. Millions of tons of lunar rock slid apart, revealing subterranean dry docks. Ships the size of city blocks began to power their main drives. They were ugly. They had no aesthetic grace. They were painted gunmetal gray, bristling with heavy kinetic batteries, missile pods, and massive, forward-facing railguns that ran the entire length of their hulls. In the orbital habitats around Mars, alarms screamed. Mechanics dropped their hydrospanners and sprinted for deployment shuttles. Bars emptied in seconds. Men and women, hardened by gravity training and void combat simulations, suited up in heavy, powered armor. There was no cheering. There was no jingoistic fanfare. This was a blue-collar military, treating war not as a glorious adventure, but as a dirty, brutal job that needed to get done. The fleet designations lit up the tactical boards in Geneva: the Roosevelt, the Churchill, the Sherman, the Patton. History's ghosts, wrapped in titanium and depleted uranium. Admiral Carter stood on the bridge of his flagship, the dreadnought Retribution. He watched through the main viewport as the massive fleet formed up, thousands of ships aligning their vectors. "All ships report green across the board, Admiral," the COEM's officer reported. "Slipspace drives are spooled and synchronized, target coordinates locked on the Valera system." Carter looked at the chronometer. Jump. Space did not bend gracefully for human engines. Humanity hadn't mastered the elegant, seamless hyperspace glide of the older races. Human slipspace drives tore a hole in reality, violently shoving the ship through the wound before the universe could heal itself. Outside the viewport, the void of space shattered like glass. The fleet drove forward, plunging into the dark. Valera Prime was dying. The sky, once a brilliant, crystalline turquoise, was choked with thick, black smoke. The planetary defense grid, a network of orbital platforms designed for deterring pirates, had lasted exactly 47 minutes against the hegemony vanguard. Now, the orbital space above the capital city was dominated by the enemy. The hegemony flagship, the inevitable truth, hung in low orbit, a massive triangular wedge of polished obsidian. It was a beautiful, terrifying machine. Below it, the city of Ethelgard, a sprawling metropolis of spire trees and crystal bridges, was burning. Fleetmaster Corvus stood on the observation deck of the flagship, his 4 eyes locked on the tactical displays. He was a creature of absolute order. The hegemony did not hate the Valerians. Hate was an emotion, and emotion was inefficient. The Valerians simply occupied a strategic choke point, and they refused to surrender it. Therefore, they had to be removed. It was a simple equation. "Planetary shields in the northern hemisphere have collapsed, Fleetmaster," his tactical officer hissed, his mandibles clicking over the console. "Ground resistance is localized to the capital's central plaza. They are using small arms. Negligible threat." "Begin the orbital bombardment," Corvus ordered evenly. "Target the civilian shelters first. Break their will. Then level the central plaza." Charging plasma batteries. Down on the surface, Arthur, who had managed to secure a shuttle off the assembly station and rush home to die with his people, stood in the rubble of the central plaza. He held a scorch-marked plasma rifle, his hands shaking. Around him, a few hundred Valerian militia crouched behind overturned hovercars and shattered marble pillars. They looked up at the sky. Through the smoke, they could see the glowing red undersides of the hegemony ships, charging their main weapons. It was over. Arthur dropped the rifle. He closed his eyes, waiting for the blinding flash of plasma that would turn him to ash. But the flash didn't come. Instead, the sky screamed. It was a sound that defied the vacuum of space, translating through the atmospheric friction and electromagnetic interference as a deafening, violent, tearing sound. The ground shook violently, throwing Arthur to his knees. He opened his eyes and looked up. Above the hegemony blockade, space was bleeding. Massive, jagged rifts in reality ripped open. Out of the violent, purple energy, ships began to spew forth. They did not decelerate smoothly. They slammed into real space with brutal, kinetic violence. They were not elegant. They were massive, blocky monstrosities of grey metal and glowing red heat sinks, and there were thousands of them. On the bridge of the inevitable truth, Corvus staggered as a shockwave rattled his flagship. "Report! What is happening? Who are they? Unknown configuration. Unknown energy signatures." The tactical officer's voice rose in panic, a severe breach of hegemony protocol. "They just tore through slip space without using a hyperlane. That's impossible. Raise deflector shields. Reorient main batteries to the new arrivals," Corvus barked. Before the hegemony fleet could even turn, the human dreadnought Retribution fired. Humanity didn't use plasma. Plasma dissipated over distance. Humanity didn't use lasers. Lasers could be refracted by advanced shields. Humanity used railguns. They used electromagnetism to accelerate a 2-ton slug of depleted uranium to a fraction of the speed of light. The slug crossed the distance between the Retribution and a hegemony heavy cruiser in less than a second. The hegemony shields, designed to absorb energy weapons, flared brilliantly for a microsecond before the sheer kinetic mass punched straight through. The slug hit the cruiser's hull, cracked the ship's spine, passed entirely through the engineering deck, and exited the other side, carrying the ship's reactor core with it. The cruiser detonated silently in the void, a blossoming flower of fire and debris. Corvus watched in absolute horror. One shot, a single, primitive kinetic projectile, had just vaporized a heavy cruiser. "Incoming transmissions!" the communications officer screamed. "On all frequencies. They are overriding our local network." "Put it on," Corvus demanded. The sterile, ambient noise of the hegemony bridge was suddenly replaced by a heavy, rhythmic thump. It sounded like a heartbeat or a war drum. Then a voice spoke. It was deep, rough, and translated into perfect hegemony standard. "This is Admiral Arthur Carter of the United Terran Systems. To the hegemony forces currently orbiting Valera Prime, power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." Corvus snarled. "Arrogant primitives. Target their lead ship. Fire everything." The hegemony fleet opened up. Hundreds of beams of superheated plasma lanced out, striking the Terran ships. The plasma splashed against the ablative armor of the human dreadnoughts, scarring the paint, melting the outer layers of titanium, but failing to penetrate the thick, brutalist hulls. The human ships didn't even bother to evade. They just kept moving forward, an unstoppable wall of iron. "Warning ignored," Carter's voice echoed over the comms. "All Terran vessels, weapons free. Break them." The void lit up, not with the elegant, colorful beams of standard galactic warfare, but with the rapid-fire, strobe-light flashes of kinetic artillery. Tens of thousands of mass driver rounds filled the space between the two fleets. It was a wall of solid metal moving at relativistic speeds. The hegemony ships were shredded. Escort frigates were torn in half. Destroyers were reduced to drifting scrap as tungsten rounds punched through their hulls, venting atmosphere and crew into the cold vacuum. Down in the plaza, Arthur watched the sky. The red underbellies of the hegemony ships were dying out, replaced by a rain of burning debris. He watched as a massive grey ship, larger than anything he had ever seen, descended through the upper atmosphere. The ship didn't care about aerodynamics. It pushed the air out of its way through sheer thrust, its engines roaring like chained beasts. On the side of the massive hull, painted in stark white letters, was a single word: Earth. Arthur fell to his knees in the ash, tears streaming down his face. The galaxy had forgotten them, but the muddy death world on the edge of the Orion Spur had remembered. Humanity had come to pay its debts. The dropship didn't land. It impacted. Hundreds of tons of armored plating slammed into the shattered marble of the central plaza, crushing 2 hegemony hover tanks beneath its landing struts. The shockwave knocked Arthur flat on his back. Dust and pulverized stone plumed outward in a massive, choking ring. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the sides of the massive vessel blew outward with the sharp, concussive crack of explosive bolts. The heavy steel ramps slammed down. Hegemony shock troopers, clad in sleek, pearl-white carapace armor, reoriented their weapons. They were elite infantry. They had conquered a dozen worlds. They raised their plasma rifles in perfect synchronized unison, aiming at the dark, yawning maws of the human dropship. Heavy, mechanized footsteps answered them. The Terran Marines deployed. They did not sprint out in a disorganized charge. They advanced in a relentless, measured march. They wore Mark IV powered assault armor, hulking suits of olive drab and gunmetal gray that made them look less like soldiers and more like walking tanks. The armor was scratched, scarred, and utilitarian. There were no decorative crests. There were no bright colors. "Contact front," a voice barked through external speakers, amplified and metallic. "Clear the square." The Hegemony troopers fired. Brilliant streaks of superheated plasma splashed against the Terran armor. The localized heat dispersal shielding on the human suits flared, glowing cherry red for a moment, before venting the thermal energy as a cloud of steam. The Marines didn't flinch. They didn't even break stride. A human in the vanguard, designated by a pair of faded white chevrons on his shoulder plate, raised a heavy squad automatic weapon. "Suppressing," Sergeant Miller said. He pulled the trigger. The weapon roared. It was not the high-pitched whine of an energy cell discharging. It was the deafening, mechanical violence of a chemical explosion driving a heavy, tungsten-core slug down a rifled barrel at 3,000 feet per second. Miller's weapon spat fire, ejecting spent brass casings in a continuous glittering arc. The Hegemony kinetic shields flickered into existence, glowing a faint blue. They were designed to absorb grazing hits, shrapnel, and low-velocity impacts. They were not designed to stop sustained, armor-piercing machine gun fire. The shields popped under the sheer volume of mass. The tungsten slugs tore through the pearl-white carapace armor like it was made of wet paper. Hegemony troopers were thrown backward by the kinetic force, their sleek formations instantly reduced to a chaotic tangle of shattered limbs and ruined armor. "Push up! Push up!" Miller shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. "Left flank, Jenkins! Hit that high ground!" A Marine on the left flank hoisted a bulky, tube-like weapon onto his shoulder. He took a knee, locked the targeting laser onto a Hegemony sniper nest nestled in a ruined spire, and fired. The rocket left a thick trail of white smoke before detonating against the spire. The high-explosive anti-tank warhead didn't just kill the snipers, it vaporized the entire top half of the structure, raining liquid glass and pulverized concrete down on the enemy below. Arthur watched from behind his overturned hovercar, completely paralyzed. The Valerians fought with elegant, non-lethal suppression fields and precision lasers. They sought to neutralize. The humans did not seek to neutralize. They sought to eradicate. A Hegemony commander, distinguished by a crimson sash over his armor, stepped out from behind a pillar. He leveled a heavy plasma cannon at Sergeant Miller, the weapon whining as it drew power for a lethal, overcharged shot. Miller didn't have time to reload. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and drew a thick, heavy sidearm from his thigh holster. He didn't aim. He just leveled it and fired twice. The heavy .45 caliber hollow points caught the Hegemony commander in the chest plate. The kinetic transfer knocked the alien completely off his feet, the plasma cannon firing wildly into the sky as he fell. Silence descended on the plaza. It was sudden and absolute, broken only by the hiss of venting steam from the Marine's armor and the clatter of a few final brass casings rolling across the marble floor. The firefight had lasted less than 90 seconds. The Hegemony presence in the Capitol Square was gone, erased. Miller hit a release valve on his collar. The pressurized seal of his helmet hissed, and he pulled it off. He was entirely unremarkable. He had a crooked nose, a dusting of stubble on his chin, and deep, dark circles under his eyes. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been working a 20-hour shift at a factory. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a thick, armored glove and looked around the ruined square. His eyes finally landed on Arthur. Miller reached into a pouch on his chest rig, pulled out a small metallic canteen, and walked over to the trembling Valerian. He stopped, looking down at Arthur's terrified expression, and then at the scorched plasma rifle lying uselessly in the dirt. "You look like hell, pal," Miller said, his voice completely devoid of the metallic distortion from the helmet. He offered the canteen. "Drink. It's just water." Arthur took the canteen with shaking hands. He took a sip. It was cold, clean, and tasted faintly of iron. He looked up at the human, his voice barely a whisper. "You came." "Yeah," Miller said, looking up at the sky where the burning remains of the hegemony fleet were still raining down like artificial meteors. "Admiral Carter said you guys were in a bad spot. Command told us to pack our bags. The assembly," Arthur stammered, trying to reconcile the political reality with the heavily armed giant standing in front of him. "The assembly said no one would intervene. They said you were a minor species, a fringe world." Miller let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. "The assembly is a bunch of suits who wouldn't know a threat if it bit them on the arse. We didn't ask for their permission." Another Marine stepped up beside Miller. She carried a bulky medical kit strapped to her leg. "Sergeant, perimeter is secure. Air support has pushed the remaining enemy armor into the western quadrant. The heavy lifters are bringing down the field hospitals now." "Good," Miller nodded. He looked back at Arthur. "We're going to get your people patched up. Then we're going to go find whoever gave the order to burn this city, and we're going to have a very short conversation with them." Arthur stared at the Terran crest painted on Miller's chest plate. A simple, archaic globe, wrapped in olive branches, superimposed over a sword. "Why?" Arthur asked, the tears finally spilling over. "Why risk everything for us? You will face the wrath of the entire hegemony. You will be outcasts." Miller stopped. The casual blue-collar demeanor vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by something ancient and fiercely loyal. 200 years ago, my great-grandfather was drinking irradiated water out of a mud puddle, Miller said quietly. "Your people gave us the stars. Humans have a lot of flaws, friend. We're stubborn. We're violent. We hold grudges. But we always pay our debts." High above the burning world, the void was littered with the carcasses of the hegemony vanguard. Fleetmaster Corvus was bleeding. A jagged piece of shrapnel from a blown console was lodged in his secondary arm, trailing a thick, dark fluid across the polished floor of the bridge. The inevitable truth was dead in the water. The primary reactor was offline, the slipspace drive was a melted slag heap, and life support was currently running on auxiliary batteries. Through the main viewport, Corvus stared at the human dreadnought. The Retribution sat perfectly still in the vacuum, its massive, forward-facing railguns pointed directly at the bridge of his flagship. It wasn't firing. It was just sitting there, a silent, grey monolith of absolute power. "Damage report," Corvus managed to choke out, clutching his wounded arm. "Fleet integrity is at 14%, the tactical officer whispered. The arrogance that usually defined the hegemony officer corps was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant terror. 32 cruisers lost, all destroyers neutralized. We have lost contact with the ground forces." "Communicate with command," Corvus ordered. "Tell them we have encountered a Tier 1 hostile civilization. We need the Armada. We need the core fleet." The communications officer shook his head slowly. "I can't, Fleetmaster. They are jamming us. But it's not a standard electronic countermeasure. They are flooding the quantum network with raw, unformatted data. It's..." It's noise. Just static and noise. We are cut off. Humanity hadn't just destroyed their ships. They had locked the door behind them. A heavy digitized chime rang out across the bridge. The main holographic projector, flickering and sparking, suddenly forced itself to life. The security overrides were bypassed with humiliating ease. Admiral Carter's face appeared in the center of the bridge. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man reviewing a spreadsheet. "Fleetmaster Corvus," Carter said, reading the name off a datapad just off screen. "Your ship is currently operating on emergency power. My targeting sensors indicate your hull integrity is compromised. If I sneeze on the trigger of my secondary batteries, you and your crew will be vented into space." Corvus straightened his spine. He would not show fear to a primitive. "You have committed an act of unprovoked aggression against the hegemony. The core fleet will reduce your insignificant mud ball of a planet to ash for this." "Unprovoked?" Carter raised an eyebrow. He tapped his console. The projection split, showing the burning surface of Valera Prime. "You glassed 3 civilian colonies and were about to execute a planetary bombardment on a defenseless species. Don't lecture me about provocation, Corvus. You don't have the moral high ground here. You don't even have a functioning ship." "What do you want?" Corvus snarled. "Unconditional surrender," Carter replied flatly. "You will power down all remaining defensive grids. You will order your surviving ground forces to lay down their arms and submit to Terran custody. You will transmit your naval encryption keys to my ship. And if I refuse?" Carter leaned forward. The cold, mechanical apathy in his eyes was far more terrifying than any threat of violence. "If you refuse, I will order my ships to target your life support systems. I will not blow you up. I will simply turn off your heat and your air. I will let you freeze to death in the dark, while you watch my transports descend to clean up your mess on the ground. The choice is yours, Corvus. I need your answer in 30 seconds. Corvus looked at his tactical officer. The officer looked away. He looked at the smoking ruins of his bridge. The hegemony was built on the premise of overwhelming, undeniable superiority. They had never encountered an enemy that simply absorbed their blows and punched back hard enough to shatter their spine. 10 seconds, Carter said, his voice entirely conversational. "We surrender," Corvus whispered. The words tasted like ash. "I will transmit the codes." "Smart decision," Carter said. "Prepare to be boarded. Terran Marines will be arriving shortly to secure your vessel. Do not resist." The transmission cut out. Down in the bunker beneath Geneva, President Mitchell watched the telemetry data flood in from the Valera system. The red icons of the hegemony fleet were winking out one by one, replaced by the white markers of Terran custody. He leaned back in his steel chair, running a hand over his tired face. It was done. The veil was lifted. "Mr. President," a junior aide stepped into the room, holding a secure comms receiver. He looked pale. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission. It's routed through the diplomatic buoy at the edge of the Sol system." "From who?" Mitchell asked. "From the Galactic Assembly, sir. The core worlds. They are demanding an immediate explanation. They are threatening severe economic sanctions. They say we have destabilized the entire quadrant." Mitchell stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with slow, deliberate precision. The political game was over. The galaxy had demanded a response, and humanity had given them one. "Put them on the main screen," Mitchell said. The bloated, gelatinous form of Grove, the core world's representative, appeared on the large monitor. He was pulsing a violent, angry red. "President Mitchell!" Grove shouted, his translator struggling to keep up with his indignation. "Your actions are a direct violation of interstellar law. You have deployed an illegal armada. You have assaulted a sovereign hegemony fleet. The assembly demands you recall your ships immediately, or face the full consequences of the entire galactic—" "Shut up," Mitchell said. Grove stopped mid-rant, his pulpy mouth hanging open. No one had ever spoken to a core world delegate like that. "Listen to me very carefully, Representative," Mitchell said, stepping closer to the camera. "For 100 years you ignored us. You looked down on us. You treated the Valerians, the only decent species in your entire corrupt bureaucracy, like they were disposable. You allowed a slaughter to happen because it was politically convenient for you." "We are neutral," Grove tried to interject. "You are cowards," Mitchell interrupted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the bunker. "And your neutrality is a joke. Humanity is no longer recognizing the authority of the Galactic Assembly. We are claiming the Valerian sector as a united Terran systems protectorate. Any armed vessel, hegemony, assembly or otherwise, that crosses into that sector without our express permission will be fired upon." Grove pulsed a pale, sickly yellow. "You cannot fight the entire galaxy, Mitchell. You do not have the logistics." Mitchell offered a cold, humorless smile. "Representative," Mitchell said softly, "you have seen exactly one of our ghost armadas. Do you really want to find out how many more we have parked in the dark?" Mitchell didn't wait for an answer. He reached forward and severed the connection. The screen went black. The debt was paid. The galaxy was officially on notice. Humanity was awake. The dust over Ethelgard refused to settle. It hung in the air like a heavy grey shroud, catching the harsh glare of the industrial floodlights that the humans had erected across the plaza. War, the Valerians were learning, was not just about the explosive violence of the moment. It was about the grueling, monotonous arithmetic of the aftermath. Heavy dropships, ugly and brutally functional, constantly cycled through the atmosphere. They didn't bring diplomats or aid workers in pristine white uniforms. They brought combat engineers. Within 6 hours of the hegemony's surrender, the central plaza had been transformed into a sprawling, fortified staging ground. Prefabricated hospital units, smelling of sharp antiseptic and hot ozone, were deployed from the bellies of the cargo haulers. They unfolded like massive geometric insects, locking into the shattered marble with hydraulic thuds. Sergeant Miller sat on an overturned chunk of a statue, methodically cleaning his rifle. His armor was caked in a mixture of grey dust and black soot. Beside him, Private Jenkins was eating something out of a foil pouch that smelled vaguely of synthetic beef and aggressively strong preservatives. Arthur walked toward them. He moved slowly. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, hollow ache in his bones. He looked at the human camp. There were no songs of victory. There were no banners being waved. The Marines moved with a grim, exhausted efficiency, hauling rubble off pinned survivors, directing medical stretchers, and setting up heavy kinetic auto turrets at the perimeter. "It is quiet," Arthur said, stopping a few feet from Miller. Miller didn't look up from his weapon. He scrubbed a carbon-scored bolt carrier with a stiff brush. "Adrenaline dump. Nobody has the energy to celebrate after a drop. You just want to sleep. But you know if you close your eyes, you'll see the faces of the guys who didn't make it." He reassembled the rifle with a sharp, metallic snap, chambered around and engaged the safety. Only then did he look up at Arthur. "Your wounded are stabilized," Miller said, gesturing toward the row of humming medical tents. "Our docs are good. They're used to putting Humpty Dumpty back together after high-explosive trauma. Your biology is a little weird, but trauma is trauma." "I do not understand," Arthur murmured, looking at the sheer scale of the operation. "You are warriors. Yet you build hospitals faster than you build barricades." Jenkins snorted around a mouthful of his ration. "We're not warriors, pal. We're mechanics. Sometimes the machine is a broken engine. Sometimes it's a broken city. We got a lot of practice, Miller added quietly. He tossed a foil pouch to Arthur. Eat. You're trembling. Arthur caught the pouch. It was warm. Practice? 200 years ago, we nearly glassed our own planet over lines drawn on a map, Miller said, his voice flat. He stared out at the ruined spire trees of Ethelgard. We poisoned our oceans. We burned our fields. When your people showed up and handed us the tech to clean the air, you didn't just save us from choking. You gave us a reason to stop killing each other. You gave us the galaxy. Miller leaned forward, resting his forearms on his armored knees. We spent the next 2 centuries swearing we would never let anyone do to us what we almost did to ourselves. We built all this. He gestured to his armor, his rifle, the dreadnoughts in the sky. Because we know exactly what extinction looks like. We stared it in the face. Arthur looked down at the ration pouch. The hegemony will not accept this humiliation. They are vast. They will return. Let them, Miller said. The cynicism in his voice was thick, but underneath it lay a bedrock of absolute certainty. They fight for territory. We fight because we know what happens if we lose. They don't stand a chance. Light years away, in the pristine, artificial luxury of the Galactic Assembly, Ambassador Thomas Hayes was packing a small cardboard box. He didn't have much, a few physical books, a framed photograph of his grandfather, standing in the rebuilt ruins of old New York, and a heavy brass paperweight. The door to his office hissed open. Grove, the core world's representative, slithered into the room. He was pulsing a frantic, anxious shade of violet. Ambassador Hayes. Thomas, Grove said, attempting a tone of diplomatic camaraderie that fell completely flat. We need to discuss this. The Assembly is willing to offer concessions, a formal recognition of the United Terran Systems as a Tier 2 military power, a seat on the Security Council. We can negotiate a localized ceasefire. Hayes placed the paperweight into the box. He didn't look up. There's nothing to negotiate, Grove. The hegemony fired first. We finished it. The Valerian sector is now under Terran protection. You are disrupting the balance of power, Grove pleaded, his voice rising in panic. The hegemony's economy is entirely based on expansion. If you block their advance into the Orion Spur, they will turn their core fleets toward the Assembly. You are endangering all of us. Hayes finally stopped. He looked at Grove. He felt no anger toward the alien bureaucrat. He only felt pity. We asked you for help, Hayes said softly. Arthur stood in that chamber and begged you to save billions of innocent lives. You told him it was a localized border dispute. You told him it wasn't your problem. Hayes picked up his box and walked toward the door. Grove scrambled to get out of his way. It's still a border dispute, Grove, Hayes said, stopping in the doorway. The only difference is, humanity just drew the border. Try not to cross it. Deep within the obsidian halls of the hegemony homeworld, the autarch stared at the massive holographic projection of the Valera Prime engagement. The autarch was not prone to panic. The hegemony had ruled for 10,000 years through a doctrine of absolute, infallible superiority. They possessed energy shields that could absorb stellar flares. They possessed plasma batteries that could melt continents. But as the autarch watched the telemetry data from Fleetmaster Corvus's destroyed armada, a cold, unfamiliar sensation crept into his chest. Pause playback, the autarch commanded. The hologram froze on the image of a human railgun slug penetrating a heavy cruiser. Analysis, the autarch demanded, looking at his Supreme Tactical Council. How did a primitive kinetic weapon bypass a Class 4 energy deflector? The head of naval intelligence, a scarred veteran of a dozen campaigns, swallowed hard. It didn't bypass the shield, autarch. It overwhelmed it. Energy shields operate on a threshold of thermal and radiant absorption. The Terran weapons do not emit radiation. They emit pure, concentrated mass moving at relativistic velocities. The intelligence officer brought up a secondary screen. It was filled with terrifying, simple mathematics. The human dreadnoughts are accelerating 2-ton slugs of dense metal to 3% of the speed of light. The kinetic energy generated by a single impact is equivalent to a low-yield nuclear detonation. Our shields tried to absorb the impact, but the sheer physical mass shattered the localized grav projectors. The autarch narrowed his eyes. Adapt the shields. Increase kinetic repulsion. We cannot, autarch, the officer whispered. To repel mass of that size, moving at that speed, our ships would require reactors 3 times their current size. We would have to redesign our entire fleet from the ground up. Silence dominated the war room. They have fundamentally broken our naval doctrine, the officer continued, his voice devoid of hope. They have bypassed thousands of years of energy weapon evolution by simply throwing rocks at us. Very heavy rocks, very fast. The autarch looked back at the frozen image of the human ship. It was ugly. It was an affront to the sleek, geometric beauty of hegemony engineering, but it was lethal. They only possess 1 fleet, the autarch stated, though it sounded less like a fact and more like a desperate hope. A surprise tactic, nothing more. Mobilize the core fleet. 3,000 ships. We will drown them in plasma. Admiral Arthur Carter stood on the bridge of the Retribution, staring into the black. It had been 14 standard days since the liberation of Valera Prime. The ground war was over. The surviving hegemony forces were sitting in prisoner-of-war camps, eating human MRAs and staring blankly at the sky. But the sky was not safe. "Admiral!" the sensory officer called out, his hands dancing across the glass console. "Slipspace ruptures detected at the edge of the system. Massive energy spikes. It's the hegemony core fleet." Carter didn't flinch. He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform. "Numbers. 3,214 capital ships, sir. Dozens of supercarriers. They are forming up in a crescent formation just outside the gravity well of Valera's outermost gas giant." "Put them on the screen." The main viewport shifted, zooming in on the deep void. The hegemony fleet was magnificent. It was a wall of polished black obsidian and glowing red plasma drives stretching out for thousands of kilometers. It was an armada designed to conquer star systems simply by appearing in the sky. "Comms are active," the communications officer reported. "They are broadcasting on all open channels." A voice echoed onto the bridge. It was imperious, cold, and dripping with ancient authority. "Terran fleet, this is the Hegemony Corps Command. You occupy stolen territory. Your initial victory was an anomaly. You are hopelessly outnumbered. Power down your crewed vessels and prepare for immediate execution. There will be no terms of surrender." Carter slowly walked to the center of the bridge. He pressed the broadcast key on his command chair. "Hegemony Corps Command, this is Admiral Carter." His voice was utterly calm. It was the terrifying calm of a man holding a detonator. "You are currently trespassing in the United Terran Systems Protectorate. I strongly advise you to check your sensory data." Carter nodded to his tactical officer. The void of space around the hegemony fleet suddenly began to shimmer. They weren't human ships, not entirely. They were hundreds of thousands of automated kinetic minefields deployed by the Ghost Armadas over the last 2 weeks. But behind those minefields, cloaking fields dropped. The Roosevelt, the Churchill, the Sherman, and thousands more. Carter hadn't just brought 1 fleet. President Mitchell had authorized Operation Archangel in its entirety. The entire 200-year accumulated industrial output of the human race was now sitting in the Valera system. 5,000 capital ships, tens of thousands of escort frigates. The human fleet did not look beautiful. They looked like a rusted, jagged knife pressed against the throat of the galaxy. "You rely on parlor tricks, human," the hegemony commander scoffed over the comms, though the slight tremor in the translation suggested otherwise. "Numbers do not equal victory. Our supercarriers will melt your armor to slag." "I'm tired of talking," Carter said to himself. He keyed the ship-wide intercom. "Tactical. Target the rogue moon designated LV-426. Sync firing solutions with the first and second carrier strike groups. Main batteries only. Armor piercing. Solid core. Target locked, Admiral. Firing solutions synced. Fire." The Retribution shuddered. It was a violent, teeth-rattling vibration as the massive magnetic coils running the length of the ship discharged. Across the human line, 300 dreadnoughts fired simultaneously. There were no bright beams of light. There was no theatrical flash. 300 depleted uranium slugs, each the size of a city bus, crossed the solar system in a fraction of a heartbeat. They slammed into the dead, lifeless moon orbiting the gas giant, perfectly striking a fault line calculated by the fleet's tactical AI. The kinetic transfer was apocalyptic. The moon didn't explode. It shattered. The sheer kinetic force bypassed the crust entirely, detonating the dead core. The moon fractured into billions of pieces of jagged rock, expanding outward in a terrifying, silent cloud of total annihilation. Carter pressed the broadcast key again. "Hegemony Core Command," Carter said. "That was a dead moon. The next volley targets your supercarriers. The volley after that targets your home world. If you cross the orbit of that gas giant, humanity will not stop until your entire civilization is a footnote in a history book. Turn around. Now." On the bridge of the Retribution, the crew held their breath. The tactical display showed the hegemony fleet sitting dead in space. They were calculating the math. They were looking at the shattered remains of the moon. They were looking at the unyielding, ugly grey wall of human dreadnoughts waiting in the dark. For 10,000 years, the hegemony had preyed on the weak. But bullies operate on a very simple psychology. They only fight when they know they can win without getting hurt. The human race was promising them absolute, mutually assured destruction. "Admiral," the sensory officer whispered, a massive smile breaking across his face. "Energy spikes detected in the hegemony fleet. They are spooling their drives." "Inbound or outbound?" Carter asked, his eyes narrow. "Outbound, sir. They are turning around. They're retreating." A cheer erupted across the bridge of the Retribution. It started small, a few technicians clapping each other on the back, and swelled into a roar of profound, exhausted relief. Carter let out a long, slow breath. He sank back into his command chair. He looked at his prosthetic arm, the brushed steel reflecting the dim lights of the console. The bluff had worked. Or maybe it wasn't a bluff. He honestly didn't know anymore. Down on the surface of Valera Prime, the sky was finally beginning to clear. The thick, black smoke was dissipating, revealing the brilliant, alien stars. Arthur stood at the edge of the central plaza. The rubble had been cleared into neat, organized piles. The medical tents were quiet. Sergeant Miller walked up beside him. He had finally taken off his bulky chest plate, wearing only a sweat-stained green t-shirt and fatigue pants. He held 2 cups of terrible synthetic coffee, handing one to the Valerian. "They ran," Miller said, looking up at the stars. "Command just sent the all-clear." The hegemony core fleet tucked their tails and jumped back to their own space. Arthur took the coffee. He looked at the human, studying the lines of exhaustion on his face, the quiet competence in his posture. "You terrified them," Arthur said softly. "The galaxy has never seen a species so willing to embrace total destruction to prove a point." "Like I said," Miller took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the taste. "We got practice." "What happens now?" Arthur asked. "The Assembly has disavowed you. The hegemony fears you. You stand alone." Miller looked out over the rebuilt barricades, at the human Marines patrolling the perimeter, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Valerian militia. "We're not alone," Miller said. "We just changed the neighborhood watch. You guys showed us how to reach the stars. We're just making sure you get to keep looking at them." Arthur looked up. Among the natural stars, thousands of artificial lights twinkled in the high orbit of his homeworld. They were the engines of the ghost armadas. They were ugly, brutal machines of war. But to Arthur, they were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The galaxy ran on a ruthless arithmetic, survival of the fittest, power over empathy. But humanity had looked at the math, rejected the formula, and balanced the ledger with iron and blood. They had paid their debt. And the galaxy, for the first time in 10 millennia, trembled. That is how humanity balances the ledger. No politics, no endless debates, just a wall of iron and a promise kept in the cold dark. If this dive into the gritty, stubborn side of the HFY universe hit the mark, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so the next story always finds you. What are your thoughts on Admiral Carter's apocalyptic warning? Drop a comment below. Share this video with fellow sci-fi junkies, and until next time, keep your railguns loaded and always pay your debts.